The first time Princess Valera accused the human of wanting her crown, he laughed so hard he nearly fell off the palace balcony, which was not the reaction she expected from the most dangerous man in the galaxy. The guards surrounding them immediately raised weapons. The royal advisors looked horrified. One elderly minister actually whispered a prayer under his breath, because nobody laughed at the future empress of the Solaran Dominion, not openly. Not while standing 50 stories above the capital city during a state security lockdown, and definitely not after being accused of treason. Yet Captain Adrian Vale just stood there beside the silver railing, exhausted eyes watering from laughter, while the neon skyline of Asterion Prime burned beneath the night rain. "You think I want your throne?" he finally managed between breaths. Princess Valera narrowed her glowing amber eyes. "You infiltrated my inner court, dismantled 3 assassination attempts, exposed corruption inside the royal military, and somehow convinced half my guards to trust you more than their own commanders," she said coldly. "People have started revolutions for less." Adrian wiped rainwater from his face. "Lady, I don't want your crown. Then what do you want?" For the first time, the human stopped smiling. The city lights reflected across his scarred face while distant thunder rolled through the endless towers below. Then quietly, almost gently, he answered, "Your freedom." The words hit harder than threats ever could. Because Princess Valera had spent her entire life trapped inside a golden cage so beautiful, nobody ever called it prison. The Solaran Dominion ruled nearly 200 systems through elegance, control, and fear disguised as tradition. Unlike brutal empires that conquered through violence openly, the Dominion perfected something far more sophisticated. Obligation. Every royal heir belonged to the throne before birth. Every political alliance was arranged decades in advance. Every smile, every speech, every public appearance carefully engineered to maintain stability across the stars. Princess Valera embodied perfection itself, beautiful, intelligent, untouchable, and completely owned by the empire she would someday rule. She had not walked alone through a city in 11 years, had not chosen her own schedule since childhood, had not spoken honestly to another person without calculating political consequences in nearly half her life. Then humanity entered galactic politics, and everything became complicated. Humans were chaos wrapped in stubborn optimism. Noisy, emotional, dangerously difficult to control. The Dominion initially underestimated Earth during first contact negotiations. Humans lacked advanced fleets, ancient dynasties, or economic superiority. But they possessed something deeply unsettling. They treated power casually. Human diplomats joked with admirals. Engineers argued with royalty. Soldiers openly questioned commanders. The Dominion considered it borderline insanity. Princess Valera secretly found it fascinating, especially Adrian Vale. Officially, he arrived on Asterion Prime as military liaison for Terran diplomatic security cooperation. Unofficially, he became the single most disruptive individual ever to enter the royal palace. Within weeks, he uncovered smuggling operations inside the lower Senate, stopped an assassination attempt during a diplomatic gala, and openly informed the royal defense minister that the palace security grid resembled an expensive death trap designed by overconfident accountants. The minister nearly fainted. Valera almost laughed, which honestly alarmed her more. The problem with Adrian Vale was not his intelligence. It was his complete refusal to fear her. Everyone else in the palace behaved carefully around the princess. Conversations sounded rehearsed. Compliments felt calculated. Even loyal advisors monitored every sentence for political risk. Adrian treated her like a person, a dangerously exhausted person. "You know what your issue is?" he told her once during a security briefing. Valera looked up from military reports. "I suspect you were about to tell me anyway. You think being needed and being owned are the same thing?" The statement irritated her immediately. "You speak very boldly for a foreign officer. You hide exhaustion very badly for royalty." Silence filled the chamber. The human calmly continued reviewing tactical displays like he had not just insulted the future empress directly. That was the infuriating thing about him. He kept seeing things nobody else acknowledged. The late-night fatigue beneath her composure. The isolation hidden behind ceremonial perfection. The way she stared too long at civilian crowds below the palace balconies. as if watching ordinary people experience lives she could never have. It unsettled her deeply, because part of her feared he was right. Princess Valera's life belonged to the Dominion long before she understood what freedom meant. At 13, she learned which noble heir she would someday marry. At 16, she began diplomatic training. At 18, the Imperial Council assigned permanent surveillance teams disguised as attendants. By 23, she no longer remembered the last decision she made entirely for herself. The Empire called it duty, Adrian called it imprisonment. And somehow hearing the truth aloud made it impossible to ignore afterward. The assassination attempt during the Winter Ascension ceremony changed everything. The celebration filled the entire capital district with silver lights while thousands gathered beneath floating ceremonial platforms. Noble houses from across Dominion space attended the event, including military commanders, trade ministers, and foreign delegates. Princess Valera stood at the center of it all, wearing white ceremonial armor beneath drifting holographic banners. Every movement monitored by cameras broadcasting across hundreds of worlds, she looked flawless, controlled, regal. Adrian thought she looked tired. That instinct saved her life. Most security officers focused on the crowd. Adrian watched the servants. Humans survived dangerous worlds partly because they noticed small wrong details faster than logic explained them. One attendant moved too carefully, too deliberately. Then, Adrian saw the weapon hidden beneath ceremonial robes. Everything happened instantly. The assassin drew a plasma blade. The crowd screamed. Royal guards reacted too slowly. Adrian moved first. He slammed directly into Valera just as the assassin lunged forward, both of them crashing hard against the platform floor while energy blasts erupted overhead. The attacker never reached them. Adrian intercepted the second strike barehanded using a stolen shock baton, disarmed the assassin with brutal efficiency, then drove him over the platform railing into lower security barriers 20 meters below. The entire ceremony dissolved into chaos. Guards flooded the area, nobles panicked, broadcast networks cut transmission, and through all of it, Adrian remained kneeling beside Valera, checking for injuries like none of the surrounding madness mattered. "You hurt?" "No," she answered quietly. "You sure?" "Yes." Only then did he pull his hand away from her shoulder. The contact itself should have felt inappropriate. Instead, it felt strangely safe. That terrified her far more than the assassination attempt. Later that night, the palace entered full lockdown while investigators searched for conspirators. Adrian stood inside the royal war chamber reviewing security footage when Valera entered silently. "You saved my life," he shrugged lightly. "Part of the job." "No," she replied carefully. "Most soldiers would have protected the throne." "You protected me," Adrian finally looked at her directly. "There's a difference." Again, those impossible human sentences. Simple, direct, dangerous. Valera folded her arms. "You continue speaking as though the crown and I are separate things." "They are. The Empire would disagree." "The Empire doesn't get to decide who you are." The statement hit her harder than expected because secretly, quietly, painfully, she had stopped believing that herself years ago. The investigation uncovered horrifying truths over the following weeks. The assassination attempt originated inside the Imperial Council itself. Several powerful nobles planned to eliminate Valera before her coronation and replace her with a more politically manageable heir. Officially, they cited concerns about instability. Unofficially, they feared her growing independence, especially her increasing trust in human advisors. Adrian reviewed the conspiracy files with visible disgust. "Your own government tried to kill you because you started thinking for yourself." "That is oversimplified." "No," he replied calmly. "That's exactly what happened." She hated how often he reduced terrifying political realities into brutally clear truths. "You really think everyone around me wants control?" Adrian stared at her for several seconds, then quietly asked, "When was the last time someone asked what you wanted?" Valera opened her mouth immediately, then stopped, because she genuinely did not know. The silence itself answered him. Adrian leaned back against the tactical table. "Yeah," he said softly, "thought so." That night, Princess Valera stood alone beside her chamber windows overlooking the endless lights of Asterion Prime. For the first time in years, she asked herself a question nobody in the palace ever considered important. What did she actually want? Not what the empire required, not what tradition demanded, not what political stability depended upon. The answer frightened her, because she had absolutely no idea. Adrian noticed the changes immediately afterward. Valera began dismissing unnecessary ceremonies, questioning outdated protocols, visiting civilian districts personally instead of through holographic broadcasts. The Imperial Council reacted with growing alarm. The princess was becoming unpredictable. Worse, she seemed happier. Lord Malrek especially despised Adrian's influence. As head of the Imperial Council, he spent decades shaping Dominion politics through careful manipulation. Royal heirs remained useful only while isolated, dependent, emotionally contained. A free-thinking empress represented chaos. A free-thinking empress influenced by a human represented disaster. Malrek decided Adrian Vale needed removal, carefully, quietly, permanently. The trap unfolded during a diplomatic inspection tour through the lower industrial sectors of Asterion Prime. Officially, Valera wanted first-hand evaluation of labor conditions following recent civil unrest. Unofficially, she simply wanted escape from palace suffocation for a few hours. Adrian accompanied her alongside minimal security personnel. The industrial district looked nothing like royal broadcasts. Smoke-filled skies, overcrowded worker housing, children sleeping beside malfunctioning heat vents, exhausted civilians pretending not to notice armed patrols overhead. Valera stared silently at everything. "You didn't know," Adrian said quietly. "No, you should have." The honesty stung. Because again, he was right. Suddenly explosions tore through the street ahead. Buildings shook violently while armed mercenaries emerged from maintenance, corridors firing military-grade plasma weapons into the crowd. Civilians screamed, security teams scattered. Adrian immediately understood ambush, not random terrorism. "Targeted elimination, move," he shouted. Grabbing Valera's arm, they sprinted through collapsing alleyways while energy blasts shattered walls behind them. Mercenaries pursued aggressively through smoke-filled streets. "What is happening? Your council wants you dead." Several attackers cornered them near a closed transit terminal. Adrian fired first, fast, precise, terrifyingly efficient. The human moved like someone intimately familiar with violence, yet deeply exhausted by it. Every shot calculated purely to protect escape routes, rather than maximize kills. Valera noticed that immediately, even during combat. He minimized suffering instinctively. One mercenary dropped his weapon after taking leg injuries. Adrian spared him without hesitation. "You let him live," Valera said between heavy breaths. "He surrendered. He would not spare you." "Maybe not," Adrian replied. Still not killing him, the simplicity stunned her. The Dominion measured strength through domination. Humans apparently measured it through restraint. They eventually escaped into abandoned maintenance tunnels. Beneath the city, while security forces above fought remaining mercenary units, for the first time in her entire life, Princess Valera sat alone, without attendants, guards, advisors, or cameras, watching every movement. Just her, a human soldier, and the distant sounds of riots overhead. "This place smells terrible," she admitted quietly. Adrian laughed softly. "That might be the most normal thing you've ever said." The princess looked around the dark tunnel strangely. "I have never been anywhere without surveillance before." "Seriously?" "Yes." Adrian stared at her in genuine disbelief. "That's not leadership," he said carefully. "That's captivity with expensive decorations." The words should have angered her. Instead, they hurt. Because deep inside, she already knew. The following hours changed something fundamental between them. While waiting for extraction, they talked. Not as princess and officer, not as political allies, just people. Valera spoke about childhood isolation, endless tutoring, ceremonial pressure, the constant feeling that everyone around her served the throne first and her second. Adrian listened quietly, then finally said, "You know what scares your council most?" "What?" "That someday you'll realize you don't belong to them." Silence settled heavily between them. No advisor had ever framed her life that way before. Belong. The word itself felt wrong, uncomfortable, too accurate. When extraction teams finally arrived near dawn, the city above looked half-burned from the fighting. Imperial broadcasts blamed terrorist insurgents. Adrian privately handed Valera evidence proving otherwise. Financial transfers, council communications, assassination authorizations directly connected to Lord Malrec, her most trusted advisor, the man who practically raised her after her parents died. Valera read the files in silence, then quietly asked, "How long have you known?" "That he was manipulating you," she nodded almost immediately. "And you said nothing." Adrian looked genuinely conflicted. "You weren't ready to hear it." The answer angered her, because again, it was probably true. Confronting Malrec felt like ripping apart her entire understanding of loyalty. The council chamber remained eerily calm when Valera arrived later that evening, carrying evidence files beneath one arm. Lord Malrec stood waiting beside the panoramic windows overlooking the capital. He looked unsurprised that human has complicated everything. He said quietly, "You tried to kill me. I protected the Dominion." The coldness of the response shattered something inside her. "By murdering civilians during the ambush? Necessary instability? You raised me, and I shaped you into a ruler." Valera felt physically sick. Because suddenly every childhood memory felt transactional. Every lesson, every conversation, every carefully guided decision. Malrec stepped closer calmly. "You misunderstand the burden of leadership?" "No," she whispered. "I think I finally understand it perfectly." The old counselor sighed heavily. "The human filled your mind with fantasies about freedom." "No," Valera answered softly. "He reminded me I was supposed to have it." Malrec's expression hardened. "Freedom destroys empires. Then perhaps empires should stop demanding cages." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "You speak emotionally now." For the first time in years, security forces arrested Malrec moments later. Yet despite the victory, Valera felt no triumph, only grief. Because the human had not merely exposed corruption, he exposed how completely her entire life belonged to other people. The political fallout spread across the Dominion like wildfire. Noble houses divided instantly. Some supported Valera's reforms. Others feared weakening traditional control structures. Meanwhile, Adrian became simultaneously famous and hated across imperial systems. To ordinary civilians, he represented honesty. To aristocrats, he represented dangerous disruption. To Valera, he represented possibility, which honestly terrified her most of all. One evening, weeks later, she found Adrian standing alone on the palace observation deck, overlooking the stars. "You could leave now," she said quietly. "Your mission succeeded." Adrian glanced sideways. "Did it?" "You exposed the conspiracy." "That wasn't my mission." "Then what was?" The human leaned against the railing thoughtfully. "When Earth joined diplomatic relations with the Dominion," he said carefully, "our intelligence already suspected your empire controlled its rulers through isolation." Valera felt sudden coldness settle in her chest. "So I was an assignment, at first." "The honesty hurt unexpectedly," Adrian continued softly. "They wanted someone close enough to assess whether the future Empress genuinely supported Dominion expansion, or whether you were trapped inside the system too. In your conclusion," he looked directly at her, "you've been imprisoned your entire life, and nobody even let you realize it." The words should have felt humiliating. Instead, they felt devastatingly relieving. Because finally, someone saw her, not the princess, not the heir, her. "You know what the worst part is?" Valera admitted quietly. "Part of me still feels guilty for wanting freedom at all." Adrian's expression softened. That's how cages work. The sentence stayed with her long after he left. Because suddenly the palace itself looked different. The endless attendants, the monitored corridors, the ceremonial obligations, the carefully controlled schedules, none of it protected her. It contained her. And once she recognized the cage, she could never unsee it. The second assassination attempt happened during coronation preparations. Unlike previous attacks, this one came from military loyalists furious about Valera's growing reforms and human influence. Explosions rocked the eastern palace wing, while armed soldiers seized communication towers and blocked evacuation corridors. The coup moved with terrifying efficiency, because half the military secretly supported it. Princess Valera stood inside the emergency command center, surrounded by chaos, while advisors screamed conflicting reports. They breached the lower defenses, civilian districts entering panic response. Fleet command refusing royal authority. Then another voice cut sharply through the noise. "Where's Adrian?" Nobody answered immediately. Valera suddenly realized she cared far too much about that question. The human arrived moments later, covered in smoke and blood not entirely his own. "The eastern sectors are compromised," he said immediately. "We need to evacuate the civilian towers before military crossfire reaches the lower city." One general looked horrified. "Evacuation slows defensive coordination." Adrian stared at him flatly. "Yeah," he said. "Because saving people takes effort." Valera almost smiled despite the disaster unfolding around them. That was the strange thing about humans. Even during catastrophes, they somehow remained stubbornly human. The palace siege lasted 16 brutal hours. Royalist forces battled military defectors across burning city sectors, while civilians fled through collapsing transit routes. Through all of it, Adrian refused tactical shortcuts that endangered non-combatants. Again, he chose people over efficiency. Valera watched him coordinate rescue operations personally through exhausted eyes. The human barely slept, barely stopped moving. Yet every decision centered around protecting lives rather than winning faster. "You're going to get yourself killed," she told him during one temporary regroup inside a damaged transit station. Adrian shrugged tiredly. Occupational hazard. "You joke during disasters constantly. Human coping mechanism." The station shook violently from distant bombardments. Valera stared at him carefully. "You really don't want power." Adrian laughed softly. "Princess, power sounds exhausting. Then why help me keep the throne?" For several seconds he remained silent, then answered quietly. "Because I think you deserve the choice to walk away from it." That sentence hit harder than any confession ever could. Not because he wanted to save her kingdom, because he wanted to save her from it. No one had ever offered her escape before. Not even hypothetically. The idea itself felt almost impossible. "What if I can't leave?" she whispered. Adrian looked directly at her. "What if you can?" The final confrontation unfolded inside the imperial throne chamber while the palace burned around them. Military loyalists surrounded the central dais, led by Grand Marshal Terran, commander of Dominion fleet operations and architect of the coup. "You weaken the empire," Terran snarled at Valera. "You let humans poison royal authority with ideas of freedom and equality." Adrian stepped beside her calmly. "Funny thing about freedom," he said. "People tend to like it once they experience some silence yourself, human, nah." Several soldiers raised weapons. Tension filled the chamber instantly. Terran pointed directly toward Adrian. "You manipulated her." "No," Valera answered before Adrian could speak. "He showed me what manipulation looked like." The marshal's expression darkened. "You would abandon your duty for him." The princess stared across the shattered throne room quietly. Then something extraordinary happened. For the first time in her life, she answered honestly. "I don't know what I want yet." Silence flooded the chamber. Because royalty never admitted uncertainty. Never vulnerability, never humanity, but Valera continued anyway. "I spent my entire life being shaped into a symbol instead of a person," she said softly. "Everyone told me who I belonged to, what I owed, what I must sacrifice. And none of you ever asked whether I wanted any of it." The room remained utterly still. Then Adrian added quietly beside her, "That's because free people are harder to control." Terran gave the attack order instantly. The throne chamber exploded into violence. Energy fire illuminated shattered marble while guards collided in brutal close combat beneath collapsing banners. Adrian moved like controlled chaos through the battlefield, disarming opponents, protecting wounded soldiers, dragging civilians away from crossfire whenever possible. Even now, even here, he refused unnecessary killing. Valera noticed everything. One rebel officer dropped his weapon after injuries. Adrian spared him. Another tried shielding wounded attendants during the firefight. Adrian protected them both. Humans truly were terrifying creatures. Not because they fought well, because they kept choosing compassion while surrounded by reasons not to. The battle turned suddenly when collapsing support structures above the throne dais began failing. Massive debris crashed downward toward trapped civilians near the central chamber. Without hesitation, Adrian sprinted directly toward the falling wreckage. "Adrian," Valera shouted, too late. The human shoved to attendants cleared just before steel beams collapsed around him in a storm of fire and shattered stone. The entire chamber froze. Valera felt something inside her chest stop completely, then move again, harder, painfully. Security teams eventually dragged Adrian from the wreckage barely conscious, severe injuries covering most of his body while medics fought desperately to stabilize him. Yet even while bleeding across the ruined throne room floor, he still looked toward trapped civilians first. "Everybody out," he rasped weakly. The simplicity broke her. Not the violence, not the coup, that even dying. He still cared more about strangers than himself. The Loyalist rebellion collapsed shortly afterward. Without centralized command, surviving forces surrendered rapidly. The war was over. The throne survived. Yet Princess Valera barely noticed any of it while sitting beside Adrian's medical chamber during the endless recovery nights afterward. Doctors warned survival remained uncertain. Internal trauma, radiation exposure, neurological damage. The future empress ignored political obligations entirely. Advisors demanded strategic meetings. She refused. Nobles requested coronation rescheduling. She delayed everything. For the first time in Dominion history, the entire empire waited because one human soldier mattered more to the princess than imperial schedules. Public reaction became immediate chaos. Some citizens admired her loyalty. Others called it weakness. Human networks across Earth mostly produced endless messages, reading variations of, "The humans saved the space princess again." Adrian would have hated the attention. Eventually, he regained consciousness during artificial dawn cycle. Valera sat beside the chamber window, staring silently at city lights, when his voice finally broke the silence. "You look terrible." She laughed despite herself. "You nearly died." "Yeah," Adrian muttered weakly. "Pretty inconvenient, honestly." The princess moved closer carefully. "Why did you go back for them?" "Because they were trapped. You could barely stand." "Still trapped, though." Again, those impossible simple answers. Valera studied him quietly for several moments. "You know what frightens me most about humans?" "What? You genuinely mean it?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Mean what?" "That people matter more than systems." His expression softened slightly. "They do." The certainty in his voice shook her more than any battlefield ever had, because for the first time she realized how deeply the Dominion reversed that belief. The Empire sacrificed individuals for stability constantly. Humans sacrificed stability to protect individuals. Maybe that was why they remained impossible to conquer completely. One quiet evening, weeks later, Adrian finally recovered enough to walk through the palace gardens beside her. The city below slowly rebuilt from the coup while distant transports crossed peaceful skies. "You could leave now," Valera said softly. "Earth would welcome you home as a hero, probably," Adrian admitted. "Sounds exhausting, though." She smiled faintly. "You really dislike attention. I survived military politics for 12 years. Attention usually means someone important is about to ruin your day." They walked in silence for several moments. Then Valera finally asked the question haunting her for months. "When you said you wanted my freedom," she said carefully, "what exactly did you mean?" Adrian stopped beside the garden railing overlooking the city. "I mean, nobody should belong to a throne," he answered quietly. "Not emotionally, not spiritually, not completely. Leadership should be a choice, not a prison sentence. And if the Empire needs me, it probably does, then how can I walk away?" Adrian looked directly at her. "Freedom isn't always leaving," he said softly. "Sometimes it's finally having the option." That realization hit her almost painfully, because her entire life lacked choice, not responsibility, choice. For the first time ever, she actually had one. The coronation ceremony resumed 3 months later beneath rebuilt palace towers. Representatives from across Dominion space gathered once again while billions watched through interstellar broadcasts. Princess Valera stood before the imperial throne wearing silver ceremonial armor, identical to generations before her. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time, a Solaren heir approached the crown as a person rather than property. The High Chancellor raised the ancient coronation diadem carefully. "Do you accept eternal obligation to the Dominion?" Silence spread across the chamber. Every tradition expected immediate obedience. Instead, Valera looked toward the assembled nobles. Then toward the civilian crowds visible beyond the palace windows. Finally, toward Adrian standing quietly near the rear security lines. The human met her eyes calmly. No pressure, no expectations, just trust. That nearly destroyed her composure completely. Valera turned back toward the throne slowly. "I accept responsibility," she said clearly, "but not ownership." Shock rippled through the chamber instantly. The High Chancellor looked horrified, yet Valera continued, "No ruler belongs to an empire more than they belong to themselves. The Dominion will no longer build cages around its leaders and call them duty." Across the palace, countless nobles stared in disbelief. Meanwhile, ordinary civilians watching across the galaxy leaned forward silently. Because suddenly the future empress sounded human. "I will serve this civilization," Valera declared. "But I will not sacrifice my humanity to do it, and neither should anyone else." The chamber remained frozen for one long, breathtaking second. Then applause erupted. Not polite ceremony, real emotion. Real hope, real relief, because millions across the Dominion secretly felt trapped by systems demanding obedience over identity. And now their empress admitted the truth aloud. After the ceremony, Adrian found Valera alone on the upper balcony overlooking the city lights. "You just terrified half the aristocracy," he informed her casually. "Only half. Give it time." She laughed softly. The sound felt freer now. "Lighter, different, you know," she admitted quietly. "For months, I genuinely believed you wanted my throne." Adrian leaned beside her against the railing. "Sounds exhausting, honestly, yes," she said softly. "I finally understand that now." The night winds crossed the balcony, while transports moved like glowing rivers between distant towers. Then Valera asked the question she feared most. "What happens next?" Adrian looked toward the endless stars above the city. "Whatever you choose," such a simple answer. Yet nobody had ever given her one before. The future suddenly felt enormous. Not because of power, because of possibility. Years later, historians would argue endlessly about how the Solaren Dominion transformed from rigid imperial control into one of the most politically open civilizations in known space. Some credited economic reforms, others diplomatic pressure from Earth. A few praised Empress Valera's leadership directly. But ordinary people remembered a simpler story. A human soldier looked at a princess surrounded by unimaginable power and saw a prisoner instead. That changed everything. Because the greatest thing humanity ever brought to the stars was not superior weapons or military strength. It was the dangerous idea that no person, no matter how powerful, should ever stop belonging to themselves. One quiet night, many years later, Valera stood beside Adrian, once again on the palace balcony, where everything truly began. The city below now alive with music, civilian celebrations, unrestricted movement, people laughing freely through streets once buried beneath fear and obligation. "You know," Adrian said thoughtfully, "the first time you accused me of wanting your crown, I almost asked whether you'd actually spent 5 minutes wearing the thing." Valera smiled against the cool night air. "And now I think you wear it because you chose to." The difference mattered more than entire wars. She leaned beside him quietly, while stars burned across the endless sky. "I used to think freedom meant abandoning responsibility," she admitted softly. "And now I think freedom means responsibility can no longer erase who you are." Adrian looked at her carefully. "That sounds pretty human, actually," Valera laughed. Then, for the first time since childhood, the crown on her head finally stopped feeling like chains.